we've recognized for a number of years now that if we do not pay attention to succeeding generations, if we do not create space and voice for youth of all types, we are not creating space for them to engage in the future. This session is called Minding the Gap, Creating Economic Opportunities for Youth. One of my first jobs after graduate school is actually associated with the International Labor Office, and they estimate that there's 73 million youth unemployed in 2013. That's in the formal economy. When you get into the informal economy, the numbers are larger. We're talking about 50% unemployment, roughly, of youth in South Africa. There is a recognition that if we do not get our arms around the role and the rights to dignity, a job, a sense of future potential for youth, we are squandering their future. And we have today a tremendous moderator in Nicole Golden, who's known as a sort of leading expert on inclusive global development, and especially for her pioneering work on youth, young women, and girls. And so I'll turn it over to you, Nicole.
It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here among such distinguished colleagues and friends, and of course this panel we've assembled today. Their full bios are in your packet, but I did just want to take a quick minute to introduce them and also to thank the Alliance for International Youth Development and of course UPS for being here today and supporting the participation of a couple of our young professional panelists. We have Taka Chirai with us, to my far right, from Zimbabwe. Taka is a consultant with the Talent Cloud and with Workforce Connections project at FHI 360, and we're so glad you're with us.
Thank you.
Dan Bruto, to my right, is a UPS Foundation trustee and the retired president of UPS International, and we're really excited about his insights that we're going to hear today. To my left, we have Kristen Lord, who is president and CEO of IREX, and also with us today in her capacity as 2015-2016 co-chair of AIYD, of the Alliance, and I'm glad to see Pat Fine, the other co-chair, here as well. And certainly last but not least, to my left, we have Moses Tia from Ghana, where he serves as executive director of the Savannah Young Farmers Network, also known as SAVANET, and he's also a Mandela Washington Fellow. So again, really excited to have you all with us. When I was preparing some thoughts for today, I started thinking about my first job. My first jobs were as a babysitter, as a frozen yogurt store counter help, and when my older brother would allow in the winter months and when he'd cut me in on the action, a snow shoveler, but he didn't want to share that opportunity too often. And when I think back to what I sort of gained from that experience, and if you all kind of just take a moment and think back and reflect on your own first jobs, it was the sense of empowerment. Sure, the pocket change, the income was important, and as that sort of grew, obviously it became a much more important factor in my life and enabled me to save and spend on things that were important to me. But it was also that sense of empowerment when I think about some of the skills that I learned from that experience, responsibility, time management. It really was important, I think, in helping sort of shape life going forward. And so it really is truly unfortunate, as Sam mentioned, that so many hundreds of millions of young people around the world today are not able to get that experience, especially that first experience. The economic opportunities today are so unfortunately limited by a number of factors, and the numbers really are staggering. When we think about the fact that half the world's population is under the age of 30, significant majorities of which are living in developing and emerging economies and fragile states, the fact that up to 4 times that young people are up to 4 times more likely to be unemployed than the rest of the population really is a major concern. When we think about what's driving it, The challenge is that it really is very complex. There is no one single cause to the current crisis of employment and also underemployment, which we'll talk a little more about. And there's no single solution, but hopefully today we'll start to unpack what some things are working to address some of the challenges. We know that the global economic recession and downturn has unfortunately disproportionately affected young people. We know that there's just not simply enough jobs being created, so we're going to talk about how to increase demand, how to increase investment to create those jobs. The IFC in their study reported that in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia alone, 1 million jobs a month are needed just to keep up with new entrants into the labor force. Not to mention the existing young people who are currently out of work, but just to keep up with population growth and the demographics, 1 million jobs a month are needed, which is a staggering number when you think about it. So we really need to think about what's working and how do we get to scale. But one of the other key challenges that I think, I'm looking for, to focus on a little bit today is this idea of the skills mismatch and the skills gap. Unfortunately, a number of young people that even are able to get through school or training are coming out with either the skills that don't match the jobs that are available or not the right skills. So we have challenges of over-education, if you will, of under-education in some places, of a labor market mismatch. And so that's something that we really want to think about and drive home. As Sam mentioned, and I'm sure we're going to hear more from Kristen and others, the implications of this not only affect, of course, young people as individuals and their futures, but also really affects the sort of national development and the global growth context, international security context as well. But the reason we really want to address this issue and to unlock this potential is because of the opportunity. So as much as we have a challenge and as much as we really need to raise our attention to this and raise our investment in solving this crisis, the benefits hopefully will outweigh the costs. If you look at some of the conversation around what's the demographic dividend, right? This theory, it's not a theory, but this idea that when we have a large population, a youthful population, when they are invested in, when they are productive in the workplace, when they earn money that they then go out and spend in the economy, you have an economic growth boon. And we saw that in East Asia in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. As much as a third of that miracle growth, if you will, is often attributed to the demographic dividend and that investment. So there's a lot to be excited about if we can get this right. And I'm really hopeful that the rest of this conversation can help us think about how to get this right, how to move forward. Before turning to our panel, I was reminded of one of my favorite quotes from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which was, "We cannot always build the future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future." So that's what we want to think about. How can we really build our youth for the future? And so with that, I'm gonna ask our panelists to address a couple kind of opening questions. One is, I'd like you to share what your first job was and what you learned from it, your first kind of paid job and what you learned from it. But also moving it forward to where your current perspectives are, what do you see as the skills and the competencies that young people need today to succeed today and in the future? So, Kristen, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, before I jump in, my first job not babysitting, but where I actually showed up every day and got a paycheck, was working on a tobacco farm. It is filthy, hard work, but at the time it seemed totally normal because a lot of the other kids in my town also worked on a farm in the summer. What I learned from that is that what you find acceptable work changes, because a lot of young people after, we all thought this was normal, this backbreaking work, but apparently young people after us wised up and found out that even working at McDonald's was a lot cleaner. And so interestingly enough, young people fled this sector of the market, and the farmers who had been in the community for decades and decades had to start bringing migrant workers in to do the same work that teenagers like me used to do for them. So that's what I learned from it. And I think we see that with many young people around the world, is that they're just not interested in doing some of the things that their predecessors did. So.
Absolutely. And I think that's something we're going to come back to, particularly in the agriculture space. And I know something that obviously Moses does a lot of his work on. But given your work, at IREX and your previous experience, what is your take on what's needed? What do young people need to succeed today in the workplace and in employment?
So one of the things I'd like to start with is how do we even think about this booming generation of young people? There are 1.2 billion youth in the world right now. That is the largest generation of young people in human history. And the question I think all of us need to answer together is, are we going to see this as a threat and talk about it as a bulge, which I personally don't attach a positive connotation to that word bulge, or are we going to see it as a tremendous opportunity and one that can transform societies around the world? And I think that is, we're at a pinnacle right now. We're at a point where we have to make a decision. And if we focus on young people as being this driving force for change, we can do that. I just wanted to quickly talk about Africa. 60% of the population of Africa is under the age of 35. High numbers of unemployed, as Sam mentioned. But also, this is a booming market. This is a growth market for so many businesses, but we do have this skills mismatch. We have young people who want jobs on the one hand, and we have employers who can't grow because they can't hire on the other. And at my organization, IREX, we've seen this quite personally. We've worked on a lot of youth issues around the world, but one of our flagship programs is managing the Young African Leaders Initiative, the Mandela Washington Fellows Program. We're very honored that Moses is one of them. But let me just give you a statistic about this program that gets at this untapped demand and the mismatch. There are 80,000 people who applied for this program in the last 2 years. 80,000 people who somehow found out about it, filled out an application, and we and our partners at the State Department, USAID, had to pick 1,000 people out of this 80,000. Now just imagine what the continent would be like if we were able to reach this other 79,000 people, and not to mention the many, many others that didn't apply. And the kind of youth development, leadership development training we're able to offer, the kind of networks we're able to offer, they would benefit so many more people. But don't take it from me, just ask Moses.
It's great. I'm glad you brought up Africa. There was a survey that was done by the African Economic Outlook on this skills mismatch, and they conducted the survey in 36 countries in Africa, and it was an expert survey asking about the constraints that employers in particular were finding to hiring new workers, in particular young workers. And it was about 55%, I think 54 to be exact, came back and said that the top constraint was this idea that they were not able to find young people coming out of school or not that had the education and training that they needed. So, and that's just one example from one region. Now, Taka, I'm guessing that your first job was not shoveling snow.
No.
But why don't you tell us some of your experiences and your thoughts?
My first job was working in my father's hardware store for food and board. No, I did. It was working in my father's hardware store, and we had to sell the products, carry cement bags into cars, and help people find their electrical goods. So yeah.
And what did you learn from that experience?
I learned you had to work really hard. It wasn't, you couldn't just sit in an office and twiddle your thumbs initially. You had to do everything that everyone else was doing. So.
Now you've continued to work with young people in your current capacity, but obviously as a young professional yourself, you've been taking that experience in the hardware store and continuing on a path of professional development. What do you think, from where you sit and from your own views and from your experience working with even younger youth and new entrants, are the skills that young people need to sort of compete today and looking forward?
Okay. So the skills, I think there's a huge gap in terms of what the curricula in schools are providing, and what the students need. there's not enough discussion with public sector or even the government. We're using outdated methods, and you find that when someone comes into the workplace, they're not prepared to use the equipment that's available. Technology, a lot of people don't know how to use computers depending on where they are, and as the market is becoming more global, these are the basic things that young people in Africa need to be able to access jobs and opportunities. So I think it needs to start with education, and then just equipping people with basic technological skills, and then communication skills and critical thinking. Because pretty much the other skills you can learn when you're on the job or Google it, but some of these, just having the base to be able to do that is what's important, I think.
Where would we be without Google? So, Dan, I'm going to turn to you. Taka mentioned technology, communications, critical thinking. So first, tell us what was your first job and what you learned from it. But then also, obviously, as being in the corporate world for so long with a leading global company, what do you see? What is important for UPS to look for in its young workers today?
Well, I can remember my first job like it was yesterday. It was with UPS. It was August 8th of 1975, and I began the day sweeping out a 40-foot trailer and loading packages in that trailer. And what that job taught me was I had to pass the sort test to get out of loading a trailer that was 140 degrees, which I eventually did about a year later. But this whole idea of promotion from within at UPS, I think, is very important in this idea of opportunity for our youth. One of the things that I'll say, quite honestly, is there has to be conditions that exist for an organization in the public sector, private sector, to employ youth in these emerging markets, to give them opportunity. And I'll just go over 4 real quick, because a lot of companies today are buying back their own stock instead of reinvesting it in these emerging markets. And when I talk to other business leaders around the world, they're a little leery about going into some of these markets and investing in youth. And before I say that, I will say for the NGO community, there's been an outstanding job done in preventing young people from dying. This whole birth rates are up all over the world. Malaria, polio, all these diseases, I think we've got well under control. People are probably eating better than they ever had before, but the bubble is now that we've got a tremendous amount of youth that, quite frankly, if you save them when they're young and you don't have anything to offer them when they get older, there could be some major problems in the world, and we've seen what's going on in the world, and I don't think I have to certainly mention that. But when a business is going to invest, there has to be 4 things that happen, and this is critical for solving part of the youth problem. One is the NGOs, civil society, government, and private business need to come together with a shared vision of how to solve youth employment. Now, my expertise is on the business side, and once they do come together, here's what a business would say. We want free trade arrangements so we can get in and out of the country without any corruption that goes on. So we need borders to be free. We need transparency that happen. That's number 1. Number 2 is a business, we need to understand what the government regulations are. Zimbabwe is a great example. You can't switch to taxation, the currency, the way of payment, and expect a business to come into that market and hire a lot of youth or to make a capital investment. The third thing we need is you need a workforce that can add value to your organization. I think most organizations want to train people, but they have to come in with a certain skill set in order to be valuable. In my age, which I'm older than probably 95% in this room, businesses used to spend a lot of time training their own people. And businesses generally did not take people from other businesses. God forbid, you would never see a UPSer go to FedEx, or nor would we ever hire a FedEx person at UPS when I was coming up. But today that's changed. And because there's so much movement of our younger generation, the expectation is companies are not going to invest a lot in training for 2 or 3 years, only to have the people they train go on to something else, many times a competitor. So that skill set has to raise up, kind of as Taka said. You have an expectation as an employer. And the last thing is there has to be a market that allows young people to succeed so they can better their life. And by succeeding, that means feeding their family better, clothing their family better, having an opportunity for a nicer place to live, having educational opportunities for their kids. If you provide everything else and give a job to a young person and that job has no future in it and their level of living does not change, you've essentially not accomplished.
It's a really important point. I mean, especially in your last point, again, something we'll, I think, come back to is this idea of underemployment. And we need to have quality work and work that is going to give people a chance to upgrade their lives and contribute to their families and their futures. Speaking of futures and pasts, last but certainly not least, Moses, tell us about your first job, what you learned from it, and then from where you sit, particularly working on agriculture or rural development as the skill set that's needed.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had always wanted to be an agriculture development professional, and I had always wanted to be a technocrat in the agriculture sector, a researcher.
That's impressive.
Very good. So graduating from the university, I remember my first CV, and that was a one-page CV that I struggled throughout the night to develop because virtually there was nothing to be kept on it. Virtually nothing to inform USAID that I was qualified enough to be given the job as a program officer with the advanced project. And I was very happy that when I received the call that I have been given a job as a program officer with the USAID advanced program in Ghana, that was good news because I knew that for the first time I would have a paycheck and be able to be responsible and carry out most of the duties that I had always wanted to do in the family. But that was a white-collar farmer job. And when I went to the office, I saw a motorbike. And this was a brand new Yamaha motorbike that was waiting for me. And when my supervisor brought me to the compound of the office, I was directed that this was my motorbike. And this was what I was to use to travel a distance compared to Washington, D.C. to New York. And I was to travel a distance of Washington, D.C. to New York. I have traveled that distance, and I know how far it is on a train and on a vehicle compared to a motorbike. And that was to train farmers and also to work as a commercial farmer and then to return back to the regional office. So I see my first job was clearly that you were going into an agricultural profession which is full of the dirt that Christine said, the dust that Christine mentioned, and the skin color change that Christine didn't mention because that was in the US. So I got to know that that was it. I was not going to sit in an air condition. I was not going to ride in a four-wheel drive where AC is going to be my comfort. I knew that from the beginning. And currently, although I can get to the field with a vehicle, I still appreciate the motorbike that I use.
I bet. So, so you work with young farmers. You obviously have been thinking about your own future and where you would like to go from here and from what you're doing now. What do you think are the skills that have enabled you to be successful? Where do you think your colleagues, your generations behind you, if you will, will need to be successful today, but also looking forward 5 years, 10 years?
I think, first of all, the skills that I think position me strategically to be successful in the agriculture sector, that today I have so many networks that I work with, has to do with the fact that I went into agriculture not as a white-collar job, that I was going to sit under an AC and drive in a four-wheel. I cleared my mind of that. That was not what I was going in for. I knew I was going in for business. So I think that as a young person, with so many young people in Africa and even across the world who would like to go into the agri sector, you must get in there as an entrepreneur. When you get in there as an entrepreneur, you don't see agriculture as a culture anymore. Because when you go into agriculture and you see it as a culture, then you see it as practices and systems that are transferred from one generation to another generation, that is not lucrative, that is not sustainable, that cannot raise you $10,000. But when you go into agriculture as an entrepreneur, you see that you're going to employ ICT for agriculture development, you're going to have your own M&E systems to monitor your farm business, you're going to go into radar, you're going to employ people, so you are going to be taking care of human resource. So when you get into agriculture as a young person with this mindset, you're certainly going to make a way.
I'm glad you brought up entrepreneurship. It's certainly a trend, that's increasing as more and more young people face limited opportunities to get a job or have trouble getting a job. So either by necessity or by opportunity. We know young people are talented, ambitious, and enterprising. They're lashing out on their own, whether it's in agriculture. And Dean, you mentioned some of the broader environmental sort of business climate issues, and I'm curious, your thoughts on, from an entrepreneurial perspective, thinking about young entrepreneurs and the breadth and sort of depth of UPS as a business and supply chains and value chains. How do you see sort of interacting with young entrepreneurs, with young business owners as an opportunity, and as something that we need to think about that element of this as well?
Well, I mean, the backbone of any society is really small, medium-sized businesses. So, and certainly that's the case for UPS around the world. So how do you get young people involved with starting a small or medium-sized business? Well, for those of us who have started a business, at the end of the day, the first thing you need is financing. So there has to be a willingness upon the banking system or government funding or private industry that will take a chance in financing some of these young entrepreneurs. Now, UPS, we have franchisees on the UPS store, which is, by the way, around the country. I just found out from Taka that we have one in Zimbabwe. And somebody had to finance that for that young entrepreneur that started that. So number one is the financing. Two, there has to be a market to exchange the goods and services, and within that market there has to be transparency of pricing, so that the young entrepreneur understands that if I put $1 worth of effort, I'm going to get back more than $1. Young entrepreneurs aren't going to be successful if there's not a market that they can go into where they can make a return. Three, it has to be somewhat scalable. Just like Moses said, once an entrepreneur starts, there has to be the ability to scale. So I started out one farm, it works with one crop. Why don't we go to 2 farms, a different crop, 3 farms, employ more people? So the scalability. Now, scalability sometimes is limited by regulation, by government involvement, by taxation, by, I'll say, some country practices that aren't as receptive to business. So those kind of 3 things, getting off the ground with financing, getting transparency in the marketplace where your product can be bought and sold on a market where you can, or services for that matter, and 3, the ability to scale, I think are very important. Now, how well have we done with that? Not very well. And that's, just look at the youth unemployment. It's not, in my mind, because the youth does not want to work. It's because the impetus to get them started hasn't occurred. And without that starting point, a lot of bad things can happen. So I think the investment needs to be made. Now, where does the investment come from? It has to come from governments, established organizations, NGOs, foundations, and given the right opportunity, and I certainly want to hear from Taka and Moses, given the right opportunity, what can happen? What have you seen the opportunity of youth to execute given the right structure?
I knew they'd make my job so much easier. I'm asking questions, and actually I was going to go to you, Taka, because I know in some of your work you've worked with women, young women entrepreneurs in particular, and what are you seeing, what are you hearing and experiencing as far as the constraints? Just as a quick anecdote, just in terms of data for the fellow data nerds out there, on this issue of financial inclusion, there's certainly a close link in the of financial inclusion for economic empowerment of young people. And some recent data shows that globally there's actually a 20% sort of youth gap in terms of having an account having a savings account, having an account with a financial institution, where 15 to 24-year-olds about 46% versus the rest 25 and above about 65%. Then this is the sort of global data, and once we get into the developing world, that gap is even larger. So just to your point about these challenges of sort of financial access and financial inclusion, just like we were talking about having your first job, I'm sure many of us can remember going down to the bank. Some of us remember an actual sort of checkbook and check register. Some of you may not actually remember that. But anyway, it is important, again, in potential sort of savings and financing education. But Taka, let's hear from you on this entrepreneurship point.
Okay, definitely financial constraints are huge, and especially with regard to women. Borrowing money in Zimbabwe is really expensive. So a lot of businesses don't need that much capital to start up. Some businesses might need $2,000, which is not a lot of money to just kickstart. But to get that $2,000 and then have to pay back $4,000 is not feasible. So that's one. And then technology, again, being able to access simple information or being able to advertise their products, not even internationally, but even just locally. That constrains a lot of businesses which are not necessarily in the center. So if you're looking at the rural areas and things like that. And then I think information about best practices that are international. Some people have the skill, but they don't necessarily know how to bring the products up to a standard that is a good standard to sell beyond, their small homes. So sometimes it's even just tweaks in the design that they could use. So I think these are the major constraints to accessing those markets. And then sometimes it's also when people have done their research and they've set up their businesses despite really prohibitive circumstances where it's high taxation, where it takes months to register your business. After they get through that, sometimes big business does not want to talk to small to medium enterprises because you're too small. Or, you're this cooperative of women, so you're not taken seriously. So, I think it would be really useful to have sort of partnerships that mentor these small organizations or give them a chance to present what they have. Because most of the time, the people who are good at writing the proposals, the big companies who have the clout, are the ones who end up accessing these opportunities.
It's such a great point. And Moses, you mentioned this idea of social capital, of networks, and mentors as well. And Kristen, I wanted to turn to you and see, whether it's the YALI or some of the other programs, that IRIX runs or other, experience that you have, how do you see this role of mentors, of networks, of social capital as really being important as young people kind of set out into the workplace and really into life?
Well, I think it's critical. And one thing we at IREX and many of our colleagues, many of you have learned is it's not enough to put someone in a training class for a week or 2 weeks and send them back and expect that everything will be transformed. That's not really how people learn, it turns out, especially adults and young people who are above a certain age. But what we find is much more effective is mentorship, peer-to-peer learning, actually having mentors with people on site at their jobs, walking them through, letting them take the lead, but being there as a resource. This is so much more effective. And one other point I wanted to raise, if I may, Nicole, is that from the business perspective, we're seeing a different phenomenon at play. And we have both a hope and a concern about this. Businesses are so eager to fill this shortage of talent, this shortage of skilled workers that they need to grow, that we see some of them competing more and more intensely for the same relatively small number of people, when what we'd really like to see, and what some companies have started to focus on, is how do we actually expand the pipeline of talent? So instead of having this fierce competition for a small number, the whole corporate ecosystem can benefit because there'll be a larger pool, and of course this will be much better for the societies and for the young people themselves.
It's such a great point. I mean, one thing that I've often talked about is some of the maybe not necessarily hidden, but not as exposed constraints or challenges to getting young people into work. And whether that's the information gap, where do young people know what jobs exist? Do companies, how far is their reach in letting young people know what jobs are available, which is where sort of different job services can come into play. The idea of where are the jobs, and how are people able to get to work or not? Are they given a Yamaha motorcycle as part of their deal to make it work? And so a lot of these other challenges and constraints really do come into effect. But I'm curious, Moses and Taka in particular, your thoughts on what are some of the maybe misconceptions or about young people and their expectations or capabilities, and then sort of Dan and Chris, and I'm going to come back to you, sort of looking on the other side, because I think there's often an expectations mismatch that sometimes plays into as a layer on top of a skills mismatch as well. So I'm going to start with Moses and Taka for their perspective from their peers. You mentioned peer-to-peer.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, the first mismatch that I always hear, and that is very interesting for me, is that we, the young people, we are smart, we are intelligent, we are confident, but we do not have employable skills. That is the misconception that they keep on raising. That is very uncomfortable, because when you begin to hear the first three words and you connect it with the last one, there is a disconnect quickly, because if we are smart and we are intelligent and confident and we do not have employable skills, then where lies our intelligence? And where lies our smartness? So I think that first of all, we need to understand that the young people are not only intelligent, we are intelligent, they are not only smart, we are smart and confident, but we have employable skills. We have employable skills that we need to match with the labor market. The labor market needs to work harder. As you said, and I agree with you very much, that in those days there was the need for you to train staff and maintain staff and do not allow that drift that we see today. But today what we see, and I see in Ghana and African countries that I travel to work all the time, is that the labor market is putting an eye on a young man called Moses, it's putting an eye on a young lady called Christine that is very smart in this particular field, and the least opportunity, they are picking him or her from one organization to another organization. So I think that there's a need for us to appreciate the fact that we are smart, intelligent, and confident, and we have the employable skills. It's just the matching of the skills. For the fact that you picked somebody who is has an IT background and not an agriculture background to do agriculture work that did not work, does not mean the person do not have employable skills. It's just that the match, as a labor market, you didn't spend time to match their skills, and that is the skills mismatch that I think that we need to address.
Taka, what's your take on this one?
Yeah, so for me, it's been the opposite in terms of hearing, people's misconceptions about young people. We did a labor market assessment with FHI 360 last year, and a lot of the private sector organizations we interviewed, were saying, young people are lazy, young people don't know what to do, all of this. And I was thinking, okay, well, where do old people come from? It's just like, I didn't understand those responses. And I think that's really where the biggest misconception is, and or even organizations requiring 5 years experience, for hiring someone. Well, where does this person get this experience if no one's going to hire them first? So I think there's this idea that a young person should come with a package that is already complete and knowing what they need to do for the particular job, instead of looking at it as a young person just needs the opportunity to be trained in that position. Because regardless of your age, when you start a new job, you need some time to acclimatize yourself to that position. And this is the same with young people. So I think once private sector or even government, whoever an employer is, starts looking at it that way, that there will need to be on-the-job training regardless, then there'll be a shift, because you can only learn by doing.
Dan, any response on sort of where the gap is in the skills that Moses says, we have, and is hearing, you don't have. Or, from Taka's.
I guess I'll just make one comment.
Yeah.
My parents told me that I wasn't going to be anything either, so that's just in general. I've tried to soften that with my daughters, so that I wouldn't worry too much about that. This whole idea of the skills mismatch, in my mind, for industry, all has to do with the investment in people. And I think more successful organizations make an investment in people. But in order for that investment to happen, there has to be a marketplace that will be scalable. And this whole idea, and this is why I'll get back to my first point, to say the intersection of NGOs that are going into trying to do good, NGOs that have done very good around the world, the unfortunate thing is they don't create jobs. And we can't rely on the government to create all the jobs. And now it's really time for industry to go in with NGOs, with the civil society, with the education system, and private industry making the investment, because any country that's been successful required huge capital investment from organizations. That investment came from one of three areas. Number one, it came from the ability of a government to tax. Number two, it came from a World Bank, which essentially took wealthier countries' money to reinvest. Or number three, it came from organizations that saw a future that would invest their own capital and their own time. So that has to happen. The other thing I would say, and this is in relation to what Moses said, is there is a big mismatch between the education system getting people ready to be employable, and that's, I find that very disheartening that a young person says, I'm smart, I'm intelligent, and I'm confident, but I'm unemployable. Because that's a failure of an education system, which one of the things primarily the education system should do is prepare young people for the workforce, whatever entry point that is. And that entry point could be, in my case, it was loading trailers at UPS. That was my entry point. In your case, it was riding a motorcycle to the fields and getting your hands dirty. In your case, it was hauling out cement out of your father's hardware store. But the education system allowed you to understand enough about math, enough about hard work, enough about discipline to get into that entry-level job. And at the higher level, it prepared you for what would be an employable skill. So as I think about it, and I'd be interested in what you think, is what's the gap that we need to close that would get young people ready so employers would say, I'm going to welcome this person in?
It's such a great point, and one of the things we're starting to hear more and more is the importance of starting even earlier in the education system to teach employment, employability skills, life skills, soft skills, even entrepreneurial skills, so that young people that may not necessarily advance further in education, particularly in some of the countries in the developing world, will have that foundation to go in. But you mentioned investing in people, and I want to turn to Kristen because that's something you all do a lot of, and especially investing in youth. And I wanted to sort of touch back for a moment and get your thoughts on what are some elements of successful programs that you've seen that you can share with us around what do you see that's working?
So I think I already referenced some of them. I mean, that whole idea that you need to stay with people for a period of time. You don't just put them in a training program, give them a certificate and say, good luck to you. Instead, to give them that training, that education that they need, but then really work with them over a period of time. Mentorship, peer-to-peer, networking, professional development opportunities, and just recognize that this is a longer-term prospect. Now, I think that frightens a lot of people off because they say, oh, but the per participant cost is way more expensive. But if you really think about the results you get at the end of the day, instead of just pushing large numbers through much shorter programs that are more superficial, don't do any good, I would bet that the math looks a lot better at the end of the day if you look at impact, real change per dollar, than if you look at, we put, X gajillion people through some short, intensive, much more superficial program. The other area where I think there's a huge amount of potential, just listening to my colleagues here on the stage today, is that on one hand, we have talented, smart, young people who businesses won't hire because they want them to come fully formed as perfect employees of that particular company. We have companies that complain that they can't grow because they can't find the talent they need. We have other, and let's all admit to this, well-intentioned efforts by many private, public, and nonprofit organizations that are giving people skills that ultimately there isn't a match to some real job. And we could despair and weep about this, but actually if we look where the opportunity is there, maybe it's the human equivalent of the last mile. When you're laying fiber to connect people to the internet, we've done a big job, but now we need to go that last mile. Well, maybe the last mile isn't actually that hard. Maybe it's about finding ways to reduce the risk to companies to hire someone who isn't fully formed and perfect. Maybe if some other organization comes in and bears some of the costs, then that will minimize the risk enough to hire a lot more young people. There's a lot of money by international donors and governments going into education systems that are producing people who don't have jobs and aren't contributing to the economies. How do we close that gap between the employers and the education system? What happens if we actually start focusing on that last mile? I'd be very interested to hear what my colleagues and others have to say about how to close that, what maybe is a smaller distance than we might think.
It's such a great question, and we're going to turn to both Moses and Taka for their thoughts, but I want to give all of the smart people in this room a warning that I'm coming to you next in a couple minutes, so start getting some of your good questions together for our panel. But Taka, what are your thoughts on this point about last mile, but also given, again, your experience, you were a participant in NGO and other programs. What are some elements of successful programs that you've seen, and quite frankly, or unsuccessful programs? I feel like we often can learn more from what doesn't work, from talking about what doesn't work or what hasn't worked than from what has.
Yeah. So I think unsuccessful programs are programs that don't include the beneficiaries in the process, right? So, how do you prescribe something for young people and not actually include them in the discussion? So with the successful programs that I've seen, it's been very important for them to include the young people in the discussion, but not just the young people, also the private sector, the NGOs, and you can't have a conversation with just one party, right? Because it's not holistic. So I think that's key. And then I like that idea of the last mile of having the development organizations maybe, bearing some of the cost of an internship program or whatever it is that can help these young people to gain that experiential learning. And yeah, so I think that's the best approach.
Moses, any thoughts on this one?
Yes, I am very much convinced, drawing lessons from my experience with implementing youth programs in Ghana and being part of developing the Youth Manifesto for Ghana. That is the youth document that is guiding youth employment in Ghana. The number one point I can mention is that a successful program should be responsive of skills mismatch. That is the first point that any successful program should be mindful of, because currently we have a lot of intelligent young people, a lot of smart ones. A lot of them are in Africa and across the world. So any successful program should address the issue of skills mismatch. After addressing the problem of skills mismatch, the program should also be targeted towards developing an entrepreneurial approach, because the public sector in Africa, which is the chief employer, is downsizing its employment capacity. And there is no doubt that in Africa, in 10 years to come, the public sector will undoubtedly continue to downsize its capacity to employ. So therefore, the private sector needs to come up. So any successful program should be responsive of the fact that we need to develop a vibrant, competitive, and an integrated private sector. Thus, you need to develop successful young entrepreneurs in the agri sector, in the health sector, in the transport sector, in any sector of the economy. So that program should be targeted towards telling we, the young ones, that we are not going to give you a white-collar job. We are not going to give you an already made job for you to go and land into, but you are coming onto a program that will help you with all the tools and all the networks and the connections needed to be a successful entrepreneur. So when a program has this component, right away, you are bound to make an impact. And last but not the least, a successful program should be responsible of the fact that it must influence policy. And when it is not able to influence policy, surely it wouldn't go far. In Africa, many youth employment programs have failed because they have not been able to influence policy. So for you to be successful, I am convinced that you should be able to influence policy.
That's a great last point, and I'm going to turn to Dan quickly before we go to the audience. You've talked about the importance of policy and the environment, the enabling environment and conditions have to be right for you and other corporations to invest and create those jobs. And on this point about one of the things we're starting to see again, a sort of emerging trend but policies, whether they're wage subsidies or other kinds of policies that are meant to kind of support the private sector in going this last mile or in helping sort of maybe mitigate the risk associated with bringing in young people. Are there things that you've seen in your travels, in your work, whether it's from a government initiative, a partner initiative with an NGO, that you think has made a difference in your ability to train, bring in new young workers?
So I guess I'll give you an example of South Vietnam, and we'll go back 6 years ago. I was able to meet the Prime Minister of South Vietnam at Davos, the World Economic Forum, and we were thinking about investing and flying a plane in there. We had a lot of customers, technology customers, apparel customers, gym shoe customers that were talking about setting up operations in Vietnam. And the problem was the Vietnamese government took ex-military people and put them in charge of customs. And they paid them a subsistent wage. And at the end of the day, the way you got goods in and out of South Vietnam in Saigon was essentially you had to pay off these government officials, which didn't allow any major organization to really make an investment. You were essentially stopped at the border. You were stopped on the way out, you were stopped on the way in. So how did we solve that? As a business, a couple of us sat down with the Prime Minister, let him know, hey, these are all the issues. And by the way, he didn't know about it. We had a program that essentially was transparent, that our large customers would wire in the customs duties and taxes right to the government and avoid any changing of money on the border, which is generally not a good thing. So what's been the result of that? The South Vietnamese has a tremendous workforce, very industrious people. Education system is good. I would say in the last 6 years there's been at least 2 million jobs created. And you've got large organizations like Intel, you've got a small Apple plant, you've got Nike that's got a big plant. Anyway, you've got some large organizations. Now, what has that done, not only being large multinationals moving in there, but because the border trade went down, all of the products agriculturally that's, done in South Vietnam, be it the fisheries, be it the rice, be it their agricultural products, now have a way to get out of the country. So that opened up a tremendous opportunity. And if you take a look at South Vietnam on the rating of countries to do business in, which is a rating that Davos, the World Economic Forum, puts out every year, they went from about 133 down to like 43. So it can be done. There's a methodology to do it. And because of that, you're going to get organizations that will invest, that will train people, that will invest capital. You'll get the World Bank that will put infrastructure in, the ports better, the airports better, and you'll employ youth. And out of that will come the entrepreneurial spirit. Anyone who's been in South Vietnam knows, and I'll have to end with this, about the scooter story. I know when I brought my wife and kids over there, they were afraid to cross the street because if you tried to cross the street in Saigon, there's about 75 scooters wide. And if you're from there or you're familiar, you just kind of wind your way through. But I saw my wife and kids stand on the corner for like 15 minutes, and there was no way that they were, and red light, green light didn't make a difference. That was going to go on. But that caused a lot of entrepreneurial, mechanics, parts, this whole idea of getting products in and out of the country. So very important that happens to get a society kicked off, especially in the emerging market space.
Well, thank you. I mean, Vietnam, interesting example. And in the Global Youth Wellbeing Index, which I did at CSIS with IYF, we had 30 countries, and Vietnam really outperformed many of its income group peers, in particular because of its investments in health and education and the links to employment. So an interesting example on many fronts. Okay, we have a few minutes for some questions from you all. So why don't we, in the interest of time, we'll take 3 questions. Make sure, please, that your question actually ends with a question mark. So that we can then give our colleagues and our panel a chance to answer. So we'll take 3 at a time. This gentleman, please wait for a mic and just quickly introduce yourself. And again, please try to keep it brief and end with a question mark.
My name is Prem Sagar. I am also on a professional exchange program on Atlas Core. My question is that there are 58 million children out of school, and then 168 more who are in the school cannot read and do the basic numeracy, right? This is the quality of education we are talking about. And 26 years ago, we made a promise to every children that we'll provide the quality education. Private sector, especially like the investment in the vocational education is very much inevitable because government sector is not investing more than 1% since last 15 years. So how private sector, what are the plans private sector has to attain the goal, sustainable goal number 8 and sustainable goal number 17, which is going to be imposed on us in next 6 months. So in the wake of we are not increasing more than 1%, government is not increasing last 15 years, we have more than 200 million children who are kind of equal to illiterate. And we are talking about the vocational education, which is not even the part of many curriculum. So
Great.
How you see the scenario in the future?
Thank you. Great question. We're going to take one more right in front here. Again, if you can keep it brief, that'd be great.
Oh, yes. So I'm John Coonrad with the Hunger Project. My question is for Moses. Moses, what would be your top 3 policy changes that you would like to influence in Ghana?
Great, thank you. And the woman with her hand up right there? Yep. You? Yep. The one who's standing? Yep.
Hi, I'm Allie Mooney from PATH, and I just have a question. I'm a young professional here participating in the Young Professionals Forum today, and I just have a question particularly about internships and really entering the workforce. It's very challenging just to start off in any kind of capacity when you're looking for experience. Everyone wants experience. So I just want to hear from really anyone in the panel who wants to comment, how do we scale up a meaningful and feasible internships or entry-level apprenticeships for young people entering the workforce, especially given that many of those are unpaid, and that is a very large hurdle.
Great, thank you. We'll start with those three. So we've got a question about financing education. We've got, and in particular, out-of-school youth and literacy challenges that remaining. We've got a question on getting into work, and then Moses, a couple questions specifically for you. So why don't we start actually there, and then we can let Taka, Dan, and Kristen address the other two questions as they see fit.
Yes, thank you very much. After the Mandela Washington Fellowship, we had the opportunity to meet the President of Ghana, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama. So answering questions on policy, which I have always wanted to discuss at that level, is number one, is youth in agriculture development. We currently do not have a well-structured and impact-oriented youth in agriculture development policy that will ensure that Ghana, within the next 10 years, develop a new crop of young farmers, entrepreneurial farmers, who will ensure that the world's 9 billion population projected in 2050, Ghana will be a lead in feeding that population. Number two is a policy to ensure that we review our educational curricula. For a professor of econometrics to teach me holding a notebook of 25 years, to teach me what probably within the last 25 years, there's a lot of things that need to be changed. And when I look at that notebook, I realize that indeed, if he was given the opportunity to change certain things, he will change, which has not been changed. I think there's a need to review that curricula so that we can bring innovative courses, innovative programs, impact-oriented programs that will stir Ghana's development. And the last one, which I think very much we need a policy to solve, undoubtedly, will be to address rural development. Governments have come, governments have gone. Many African countries which have been privileged to travel and work with, they continue to struggle with rural development. And they try to merge it with agriculture ministry. Some merge it with the environmental sector. They continue to merge it because they do not come out with an impact-oriented policy to address rural development. These are my three priorities.
Perfect, thank you, Moses. Kristen, thoughts on either of the other two questions about financing for education and or internships? And
why don't I take the internship one, given my background. I would be really curious to hear more from you about the number of internships being a problem. From my perspective, I see more it's an issue of inclusion and an issue of quality. And on the inclusion side, I mean, I think we're all very well aware that interns are often unpaid. Internships are often a route into getting jobs, and if many of the jobs are unpaid, it really only leaves the opportunity open to people who can afford that. I'd like to tell you that we at IREX pay our interns. I encourage others to do the same, but I do think that that's a real hurdle for a lot of people. And so I would love to see more organizations paying their interns. In terms of the quality, I think this is the more important thing. To be perfectly honest and be a little provocative here, I'm going to blame young people as much as employers here. I see young people who are more interested in the number of names on their resume than the quality of the experience, but it's actually the quality of the experience that gives you the skills. You know, I think spending a year as an intern at an organization where you really learn the people and the business and get increasingly trusted and get given more responsibility, this is a far better service to both the individual who's the intern and provides better service to the organization who invests in them. Because frankly, it's a lot of work to have interns. But I actually see the trend going in the other direction. I see this move towards shorter and shorter interns, people looking for shorter and shorter experiences, and I just don't see that that helps anybody involved. So again, a little bit provocative, but I have a slightly different take.
We're not afraid to be provocative. I don't think, at least. Dan, thoughts on either of these questions as we wrap up?
I'll make two. On the first question for the education, I'll give you an example. At UPS, we've built 5 schools, 3 in China, 2 in India. And to the gentleman who asked that question, one of them that I worked on was in Navlakumbre, India, which is about 3 hours north of Mumbai. We essentially built the school. We put running water in, latrines in, which they didn't have. None of the houses that had the kids go to the school were in there. We hired the teachers. We didn't set the curriculum, but we influenced it. So now I'll give you the private side of that. Let's fast forward 5 years. We want to turn it back over, and we want to still have influence to give scholarships to many of the children to go on to universities, which couldn't do that on their own. The Indian government essentially made that impossible for us to do it. They wouldn't let us set up a trust fund. They wouldn't let us influence the curriculum anymore, and they basically said, thank you very much, shook our hands, and we were done. So private experience with public has not done very well. That being said, it's not a reason for us to run away from it, because at the end of the day, if there's a mismatch in skills of what the private industry needs for employees and what the education system is putting out, the onus, I think, is as much on private industry to go to the educational institutions and say, hey, listen, these are the skills that we need. We'll make up the difference. And that's where it comes to me and Moses, a great comment of people teaching at a low level, which means the students that are learning are at a low level. And I think personally that technology will help us today with that, because distance-based learning, if you want to understand agricultural and there are great universities that specialize in agriculture that have professors that can, through distance-based learning, train people in Africa, train people in Southeast Asia on how to do it. Now, the question is, again, with policy, will they be welcome? How will that work? And that's where, you get back to this point that it's not just one constituency that has to go in. It has to be, civil society, private industry, government, and the youth coming in and saying, hey, here's where the gaps are. How do we close those gaps by working together?
So Taka, looks like you have the last word.
With regard to the internship question, in Zimbabwe, internships are part of, they're called attachments and are part of the university curriculum. So I don't think necessarily that the internship problem, like not enough internships is a problem in Zimbabwe, but I think it's the absorptive capacity of the private sector. So I do think we really need to focus on the small enterprises that are growing so they can be able to hire more people. I don't think everyone is an entrepreneur, so I'm thinking in terms of training, we can't train entrepreneurship as a blanket solution. But for those that are entrepreneurs, if we can help for them to scale up and hire other people as well.
Well, thank you. This has been an invigorating conversation. As always, I think we posed some more questions and maybe we answered, but there's more time. So please, everyone, join me in thanking Taka, Dan, Moses, and Kristen.